owners wanted to unionize and mine owners wanted more money. 1 million rounds of ammunition were fired and the National Guard had to intervene. That's a shamefully short summary of it, but it was literally a war for labour rights. To quote Robert Evans, "We never talk about the time they got bombed and gassed and shot at by machine guns. We just leave that out of the history books. The 8-hour workday was entirely gained by polite people with signs protesting. That's how we have a weekend, not the men who charged machine gun nests and sniped at corporate guards. All these things we consider just a part of life, like the fact that you're supposed to get a weekend. All of these things were bought in blood by men who were willing to kill for these rights, who were willing to die for these things. And we don't talk about that even, though it's cool and interesting because it might give people ideas." A nice cheery one to start with. One of Columbus's men, Bartolome de las Casas, was so mortified by Columbus's brutal atrocities against the native peoples that he quit working for Columbus and became a Catholic priest. He described how the Spaniards under Columbus's command cut off the legs of children who ran from them to test the sharpness of their blades. According to de las Casas, the men made bets as to who, with one sweep of his sword, could cut a person in half. He says that Columbus's men poured people full of boiling soap. In a single day, de las Casas was an eyewitness as the Spanish soldiers dismembered, beheaded, and did worse to 3,000 native people. Such inhumanities and barbarisms were committed in my sight as no age can parallel, de las Casas wrote. My eyes have seen these acts so foreign to human nature that now I tremble as I write. The next fact. Well, interesting. This is a short fact, and we're really going for the cheery start to this video. 796 babies' bodies were once found in a septic tank in Galway, in Ireland. When the president of Indonesia, Sukarno, visited the Soviet Union, the KGB thought that it would be a good idea to send a honey trap. They hired 2 escorts to entertain him and recorded the acts using a spy camera. They then blackmailed President Sukarno, who laughed at the agents and asked them to send the tapes so that he can watch it back home. What on earth is this fact? What website have I found? Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, apparently lost her virginity on her mother's grave. Gosh, okay, fair enough. The world's oldest known joke dates back to 1900 BCE, and it was a fart joke. Here it is, something which has never occurred since time immemorial. A young woman did not fart in her husband's lap. Maybe the punchline was lost in translation. Queen Elizabeth I owned over 2,000 pairs of gloves. It wasn't because she was obsessed with gloves though. Most of her collection was given to her as diplomatic or political gifts. The Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, where Mexico City now stands, was larger and more sophisticated than many European cities when the Spanish arrived in 1519. With an estimated population of 200 to 300,000 inhabitants, Tenochtitlan was significantly which only had 50 to 70,000 people. Tenochtitlan's infrastructure was better due with advanced aqueducts, causeways, floating agricultural fields, and even efficient waste management systems. The Spaniards' siege and the aftermath all but destroyed the Greek city that once was. In 1518, a dancing plague in Strasbourg caused people to dance uncontrollably for days. It started when a woman named Frau Trophea began dancing uncontrollably. Within days, dozens of others joined her, and the phenomenon grew to involve hundreds of people. The dancers seemed unable to stop, with some collapsing or even dying from exhaustion, strokes, or heart attacks. Why did they do this, you ask? Some conjecture it was a case of mass hysteria, while another theory suggests that the dancers may have ingested bread contaminated with ergo, a toxic fungus. Ergo contains chemicals similar to LSD. The guillotine was actually used as a method of execution in France until 1977. France outlawed capital punishment in 1981, officially ending the use of the guillotine. Ancient Egyptians invented toothpaste over 5,000 years ago. Their formula was a little different than Colgate's. It included powdered ashes from oxen hooves, myrrh, eggshells, pumice, and water. Marie Curie is the only person to win Nobel Prizes in 2 different sciences, physics and chemistry. The pioneer in radiology was the first woman, the first double winner, and only in 2 sciences. In the 19th century, dentures were often made using the teeth of deceased soldiers. A famous example, looters stole the teeth of thousands of dead soldiers at the Battle of Waterloo and sold them for top dollar. Real teeth were in such demand, in fact, that many poor people sold their teeth right out of their mouths when desperate. Before the Revolutionary War, the American colonies would vote by voice, often at places like carnivals, where they may or may not have been drunk by the time that voting happened. To vote, you just called out your choice. As you can imagine, this voting method was very susceptible to corruption. Ancient Romans used urine as a cleaning agent for laundry. They didn't have soap back then, so they had to improvise, and it turns out stagnant urine was full of ammonia, which we still use to clean today. Ketchup was originally sold as medicine in the 19th century. In the 1830s, ketchup was sold as a medicine that could cure indigestion, diarrhea, and even jaundice. While the medicinal claims were later debunked, the condiment caught on. The original London Bridge is now located in Lake Havasu City in Arizona. Entrepreneur Robert B. McCulloch bought the bridge in 1968, dismantled it, and then shipped it piece by piece to the US and reconstructed it as a tourist attraction. The first computer programmer was Ada Lovelace in the 19th century. No, she wasn't programming on a MacBook Air. It was the 1800s, but she became a colleague of Charles Babbage, who had designed a calculating machine and was working on an even more sophisticated one. In working with Babbage and fellow mathematician Luigi Manabrea, Lovelace discovered that these machines could carry out complex sequences of mathematical operations. The example she wrote to demonstrate her idea is regarded as the first ever computer program. The Great Wall of China is not a single continuous wall, but a series of interconnected fortifications. Also, it was built and rebuilt over a long period of time, so the sections are often different based on the engineering and military practices of each time. The first known vending machine was invented by Hero of Alexandria in ancient Egypt to dispense holy water. It worked a lot like modern vending machines. You inserted a coin, pushed down a lever, and got your soda. Holy water. Beethoven continued to compose music even after becoming completely deaf at age 40, 16 years before his death. Despite being deaf, he still managed to compose one of the most famous of his symphonies, Symphony No. 9, aka the Ninth. A common ingredient in medicine until the 20th century was human remains. The remains were mostly commonly ground up into a fine powder that could be made into pills or stirred into drinks. People thought that ingesting a certain part of the body would help cure illnesses in that part of their own body. For example, crushed skull powder was believed to cure headaches. Napoleon Bonaparte was once attacked by a herd of rabbits during a hunting trip. The story came from the memoirs of a French general, Baron Thibault, who said that while on a hunting trip a herd of rabbits swarmed Napoleon, seemingly mistaking him for a source of food. He was forced to retreat to his carriage to escape the bunny onslaught. Pablo Picasso's full name has 20 words. Here's the name he was baptized with: Pablo Diego Jose Francisco de Paula Juan Nepomuceno Crispiniano Maria de los Remedios de la Santísima Trinidad Ruiz Picasso. And the article says, do you think when his mum was mad at him she called him by his full name? The first human flight was achieved by the Montgolfier brothers in a hot air balloon in 1783. The brothers flew 3,000 feet above Paris for a distance of about 5.6 miles. After 25 minutes, the balloon landed safely outside the city. The Eiffel Tower was initially intended to be dismantled after 20 years. It was only built as a temporary structure for the 1889 World's Fair. The tower survived for different reasons than you're likely imagining. It wasn't because it had become a landmark, but because of its value as a radio telegraph station. The world's first recorded police force was established in ancient Egypt around 3000 BC. Back then, Egypt was split into 42 jurisdictions, and the pharaoh would appoint an official for each one, whose job was to ensure justice and security. Each official had a chief of police he worked with whose title was Sab Heri Seker, or when translated to English, chief of the hitters. Next fact, the shortest war in history between Britain and Zanzibar in 1896 lasted only 38 minutes. The war was fought over who should succeed the recently deceased pro-British Sultan. A prince, Khalid bin Bargash, refused to let the British install another pro-British ruler and occupy the Sultan's place. But when the Royal Navy fired on the palace, sending it up in flames and killing 500 of Khalid's men, that was pretty much all she wrote. Ancient Greek athletes competed in the nude to honour Zeus and display the human form. Interestingly, they also did it to allow for ease of movement and to not give the upper class an advantage by rolling in wearing fancy sporting clothes. The oldest known written laws, the Code of Ur-Nammu, date back to around 2100 BC. It was written by a Sumerian king and covered, among other things, protection of property, family law, and punishment for false allegations. The Statue of Liberty was originally intended to represent an Egyptian peasant woman. The statue's designer, Frederick August Bartholdi, originally envisioned building a colossal monument featuring a robe-clad Egyptian woman to celebrate the inauguration of the Suez Canal in Egypt. But when the Egyptians passed on the idea, Bartholdi pivoted to pitch it for the centennial celebration of the US-French alliance. The Leaning Tower of Pisa has been slowly straightening over the past few decades due to engineering efforts. Since 1990, when it was feared the tower was on the verge of collapse, an international team has worked to reverse the lean. Since then, the tower has been straightened by nearly 2 inches. It doesn't sound like much, but it's made a huge difference. Albert Einstein was offered the presidency of Israel in 1952, but declined. Unsurprisingly, Einstein wanted to continue his career in science, especially considering his political experience was practically zilch. Woolly mammoths survived into the age of the pyramids. Contrary to the popular belief that mammoths died out around 10,000 years ago, after the end of the last ice age, small numbers of the huge mammals survived in several locations for another 6,000 years or so. In fact, a population of woolly mammoths roamed Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean of Siberia as recently as 3,700 years ago, centuries after the construction of both the pyramids of Giza and Stonehenge. You could take the London Underground, to watch England's last public hanging. On 26th of May 1868, Irish Republican activist Michael Barrett, convicted for his role in a bombing, was hanged outside Newgate Prison in what proved to be England's last public execution. Many of the thousands who gathered by to watch the grisly event may have travelled there by tube on the Metropolitan line that opened 5 years earlier. Newgate was just a 10-minute stroll from Farringdon Station. was still making headlines when Nintendo was founded. Most people know Nintendo as a leading light of late 20th century video game culture, but the company was actually founded in Kyoto, Japan in 1889 to produce handmade Hanafuda playing cards. In England that same year, the notorious serial killer dubbed Jack the Ripper was still making newspaper headlines, the fifth murder attributed to Jack having been committed the previous November. Cleopatra lived nearer in time to the first moon landing than the building of the pyramids of Giza. Incredible as it might sound, Cleopatra, the last active ruler of ancient Egypt, was born more than 2,400 years after the completion of Giza's three main pyramids. In 1969, only 2 millennia after her death, US astronaut Neil Armstrong took his first momentous steps on the moon. The Great Wall of China was finally completed 2 years after the world's first telephone call. The Great Wall of China, one of the planet's most famous artificial structures, was largely built over a long period extending from the 3rd century BC to the 17th century AD, and eventually stretched over 13,000 miles. Despite its ancient origins, though, construction work on the wall wasn't actually completed until 1878, during the late Qing dynasty. 2 years earlier, Alexander Graham Bell had catapulted the world into a new era of modernity with his groundbreaking invention, the telephone. On 10th of March 1876, he made the world's first phone call to his assistant. "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you." Oxford University is older than the Aztec Empire. The culture now known as Aztec may seem like ancient history, but the origin of this Mesoamerican empire is usually dated to 1325, with the founding of the capital city Tenochtitlan. By contrast, teaching at Oxford University, which still welcomes hundreds of students every year, began in one form or another as early as 1096. University, Balliol and Merton colleges were all founded between 1249 and 1264. Machu Picchu and the Sistine Chapel ceiling frescoes were finished within a century of each other. The Italian Renaissance and the Inca Empire aren't often associated with each other, yet both were phenomena of the same era. The Peruvian mountaintop citadel of Machu Picchu was completed around 1450, at the height of the empire's power, and was probably occupied until circa 1530. More than 6,500 miles away, as Inca emperors continue to enjoy their mountaintop retreat. In 1512, Italian artist Michelangelo was putting the finishing touches to his frescoes on the Vatican's Sistine Chapel ceiling. A samurai could have sent a fax to Abraham Lincoln. Perhaps the most bizarre of all the facts gathered is that there was a 22-year window during which a Japanese samurai could in theory have sent a fax to US President Abraham Lincoln. Japan's samurai class existed until the end of the feudal system in 1868. The electric printing telegraph was patented in 1843, and Abraham Lincoln charging 5 cents a glass. Nearly 3 years later, on 31st of March 1889, construction of the 300-metre high Eiffel Tower in Paris was completed. Star Wars was released in the same year that France carried out its last execution by guillotine. Woodrow is America's most educated president, despite the fact that he didn't learn to read until he was 10 years old. Wilson is America's most educated president. He is the only president to have earned a PhD, which he earned from Johns Hopkins University in political science and history. Woodrow would later become the 28th president. On September 25th, 1820, in Salem, New Jersey, I think that is, held a trial against tomatoes. The general populace believed that tomatoes were poisonous, so Robert Johnson stepped in to prove them wrong. To do so, he bravely stood before a crowd at the courthouse and consumed a whole basket of the delectable fruit. Not dying out consumption, the trial was promptly dismissed. It was the accepted practice in Babylon 4,000 years ago that for an entire month after a couple's wedding, the bride's father would supply his son-in-law with all the mead he could drink. Mead is a honey beer, and because their calendar was lunar-based, this period was called the honey month, which we know today as the honeymoon. To save the effort of sailing boats upstream, Mesopotamian traders built collapsible boats, which they would sail downstream with a donkey on board. At the other end of their journey, they would sell the frame, and when they finished trading, they would use the donkey to return home. Mary did indeed have a little lamb whose fleece was white as snow, and yes, it did follow her to school one day. In 1815, Mary Elizabeth Sawyer, then aged 9, was helping her father with farm chores when they discovered a sickly newborn lamb in the sheep pen that had been abandoned by its mother. After bleeding, Mary was allowed to keep the animal, although her father didn't hold out much hope for its survival. It lived against the odds. A novella called Futility was published years before the Titanic seemed to have predicted the disaster. Futility, written by American author Morgan Robertson, was published in 1898, 14 years before the Titanic set sail. It centered around the sinking of a fictional ship called the Titan. The ship is thought to be unsinkable but crashes into a massive iceberg, and the ship doesn't have enough lifeboats. In 1983, one man prevented a nuclear war between the USSR and the USA. Stanislav Yevgrafovich Petrov was the duty officer at the command center for the OGO nuclear early warning system when the system reported that a missile had been launched from the US, followed by up to 5 more. Petrov judged the reports to be a false alarm, and his decision to disobey orders against Soviet military protocol is credited with having prevented an erroneous retaliatory nuclear attack on the US. The Battle of the Eclipse or Battle of Hales was fought in the early 6th century BC in Anatolia, which is present-day Turkey, between the Medes, and the Lydians. According to ancient Greek historian Herodotus, the battle was interrupted by day turning into night, presumably solar eclipse, and the result was a draw which led to both parties negotiating a peace treaty and ending a 6-year war. Thank you, solar eclipse. Jean Lafitte, with his band of pirates, plundered British, American and Spanish vessels in the early 1800s, while operating out of his stronghold at Barataria Bay, south of New Orleans. When Louisiana Gov. William C.C. Claiborne put a $500 reward on Lafitte's head, the pirate responded by offering $1,500 to anyone who delivered Claiborne to Barataria. The British sought to enlist Lafitte on their side in the War of 1812, but he instead opted to fight alongside the Americans, helping Andrew Jackson secure victory in the Battle of New Orleans. As a result, he was pardoned for his crimes. We're now going to switch up slightly and take a look at 15 bizarre historical events that actually happened. Beginning with one familiar to the channel, the Great Emu War of Australia. In 1932, during the Great Depression, farmers were growing more wheat to survive. This attracted more than 20,000 migrating emu birds to attack the farmlands for sustenance in the erratic Australian climate. You may be wondering how this led to a war. You see, the flock became so big that farmers had to ask the Ministry of Defence for help. Eventually, a small group of armed soldiers was sent to wipe out the birds with weapons. During this mission, hundreds of emu birds were killed at first, but their growing number, fast speed and unpredictable movement made them difficult targets. That's how Australia declared war on emus and lost, making it one of the funny historical events. Pepsi had the world's 6th largest military. Russia loves Pepsi. In fact, Russia is Pepsi's second largest market after the United States. In 1959, during the Cold War, Richard Nixon visited the Soviet Union to convince them of the benefits of capitalism. During this visit, Richard Nixon and Nikita Khrushchev engaged in a heated argument so intense that the vice president of Pepsi offered Khrushchev a Pepsi to calm him down, and it was an instant love connection for Khrushchev with the soda. He wanted more Pepsi in Russia, but there was one problem. Russian money was worthless and wasn't accepted worldwide, so he had to get creative, and thus a weird historical exchange was planned. In 1989, Russia offered Pepsi a trade, billions of dollars worth of Pepsi in exchange for submarines, military ships, and a significant amount of vodka. This made Pepsi the 6th most powerful military in the world for a brief period, marking one of the most obscure trades in history. Pepsi later sold its fleet to a Swedish company that scrapped it. Adolf Hitler nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. In 1939, Erich Gottfried Christian Brandt, a member of the Swedish Parliament, had the unusual idea to nominate Adolf Hitler for the Nobel Peace Prize. It is believed that this nomination was meant to be a satirical critique of the political situation, but the nomination was cancelled a few days later. This caused a lot of controversy, and eventually it was decided that no Peace Prize would be awarded that year. Additional fact, did you know that Time magazine named Hitler Man of the Year in 1938? The magazine explained that this title is given to those who make an impact, regardless of it being negative or positive. The man who survived both atomic bombings in Japan. Tsutomu Yamaguchi is the only man in the world who has survived not one but 2 atomic bombs, making him one of the unluckiest people on Earth. Well, I'd argue if you've survived 2 atomic bombs, you're probably lucky, right? On August 8th, 1945, Tsutomu was on a work trip in Hiroshima. On what was supposed to be his last day of the trip, an American bomber dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. Tsutomu was less than 2 miles away from ground zero, and the blast ruptured his eardrums and burned his upper torso, but he survived. After spending the night in a bomb shelter, Tsutomu continued his journey back home to Nagasaki on August 9th. As he was telling his boss about the blast in Hiroshima, the same white flash filled the room. Tsutomu Yamaguchi was badly burned and exposed to massive amounts of radiation, but he survived the second bomb as well and lived to the age of 93. That is the definition of built different. Next we have the Tanganyika laughter epidemic. The Tanganyika laughter epidemic is one of the most mysterious events in history. In 1962 there was a mysterious outbreak in Tanzania that caused uncontrollable laughter. This laughter epidemic started with 3 students in a girls' school who just couldn't stop laughing. This eventually spread to over 1,000 students, making it one of the craziest stories in history for all time. The outbreak was so uncontrollable that the school had to be closed for several months. This epidemic lasted for a few months, and the cause of these mysterious events in history remains unknown, but it was believed to be a case of mass hysteria. Next we have the Kentucky meat shower. Bizarre events in history has witnessed animal rains and meat showers. In 1876, a rather weird incident occurred on a random morning. What appeared to be chunks of red meat started to fall from the sky in Olympia Springs in Kentucky. Most pieces that appeared to be beef were around 2 inches long, and some were as big as 4 inches. Confused people on the street who dared to taste the meat say it was beef, lamb, deer, bear, horse, or human meat. If some people are picking up mystery meat and saying, oh yeah, that's definitely human, you're probably just outing yourself that you've had a human before, no? The cause of this bizarre history event remains a mystery, though some theories suggest it was vomited by vultures flying overhead. This has to be it, without a doubt. One of the most random events that can't be explained. Here we have the trial of the dead Pope. In 897, Pope Stephen called the corpse of Pope Formosus for trial instead of letting the poor guy rest in peace. This bizarre history event has often been referred to as one of the grisliest occasions in papal history. Pope Formosus had a history of going against court rules. Pope Stephen conducted a church council which became known as the Cadaver Synod. He dug out the body of his predecessor, who had died 6 years earlier, and put him on trial for perjury and violating church law. Pope Formosus was found guilty, stripped of his papal title, and his body was thrown into the Tiber River. Here we have the fake Paris of World War I. During World War I, in 1917, the French tried to outsmart the Germans by creating a decoy Paris. The French soldiers usually relied on imprecise locations. Their plan was extremely elaborate. They turned off all of the lights in the real Paris and set up dimmed lights in the fake city. They wanted to make it seem like people were trying but failing to keep themselves undetected in the dark. Fake Paris was never actually completed, as the war ended in 1918. Even in the extraordinary history of deception, sham Paris was extraordinary, said John Patak to Bloomberg. The Great Molasses Flood. In 1919, Boston's North End experienced a bizarre catastrophe when a massive storage tank containing 2.3 million gallons of molasses burst, flooding the streets with a sticky wave. The tank that burst was nearly 50 feet tall, owned by the United States Industrial Alcohol Company. The explosion was so severe that it caused the molasses to travel up to 35 miles per hour and shoot up as high as around 25 feet high. It engulfed buildings and people, causing 21 deaths and injuring over 150 more. Many people and animals were trapped and suffocated, as the thick layer of molasses made it difficult for rescuers to locate them. Known as the Great Molasses Flood, this sticky disaster left lasting marks on Boston streets for months. This bizarre incident made history to remain at the top of bizarre American historical events. Now we have the Straw Hat Riot of 1922. In 1922, New York City saw one of the craziest events in history, known as the Straw Hat Riot. Although there was no weird law against it, back then wearing a straw hat after September 15th was considered to be a fashion crime. Those spotted wearing them would usually be ridiculed in public, or have their hats knocked off their heads. This weird practice started when gangs started forcibly removing straw hats from people's heads, as wearing them after mid-September was considered a breach of fashion decorum. Some people started taking it so seriously that it even sparked violent riots that lasted for days. While no deaths were reported, many people were injured and police had to eventually intervene to control the mayhem. All this over some straw hats. Prohibition in New York and the straw riots are events that happened at the same time. The Polish army enlists a bear. There are some weird historical events in the world that seem completely unbelievable, and this is truly one of them. During World War II, the Polish army adopted a unique recruit, a Syrian brown bear cub named Wojtek. Raised by Polish soldiers, Wojtek grew to participate in their daily routines. He would carry ammunition, wrestle them, and even join them smoking cigarettes and drinking beer. Wojtek even became a beloved mascot for the Polish army. When a British transport ship refused to let him get on board, the army made him an official army member, earning the rank of private. He even got a bunker to sleep in with the other soldiers. After the war ended, Wojtek retired and lived the rest of his life in Edinburgh Zoo. This unusual camaraderie between soldiers and the bear highlights an incredible tale of wartime companionship and marks a chapter in unusual historical events. This superstition caused fear over the comet's arrival and led to panic, as astronomers believed that the comet's tail contained cyanogen, a deadly gas. However, most astronomers dismissed this theory, but many scammers started selling anti-comet pills, gas masks, and umbrellas to protect against this imaginary threat. The hysteria reached such a peak that people rushed to buy the supposed safeguards. Two fraudsters from Texas were caught selling sugar pills at ungodly prices. After their arrest, their customers went to the extent of riots, demanding their release to get their hands on these anti-comet pills. This weird historical episode shows how fear and misinformation can drive desperate measures. Mark Twain, born in 1835 when Halley's comet passed Earth, famously predicted he would die upon its return. Remarkably, he passed away on April 21st, 1910, just a day after the comet's closest approach, making this a strange historical coincidence. And the last historical event we have here is the death of the father of tragedy. How am I going to say this name? Aeschylus, maybe. Aeschylus, let's say, known as the father of tragedy in ancient Greece, met an extraordinary death. Tragedies from Greece and Rome often show characters facing death with an ironic twist of fate, and this bizarre event is a testament to that. Legend has it that a tortoise fell from the sky after being dropped by an eagle. This eagle mistook Aeschylus's bald head for a rock and dropped the tortoise, intending to crack open its shell. Aeschylus's unusual demise in 456 BC is remembered as one of the most ironic deaths in history, particularly fitting for the father of tragedy renowned for exploring human fate and irony. I mean, that is just an insane way to go. I wonder if that has ever been repeated in history. I'd highly doubt it. And to round off this video, we've done some of the weirdest events. Let's look at some weird people in history. So, we begin with Diogenes, a crazy, homeless philosopher. Not much is known about the Greek philosopher Diogenes' early life, but there is much speculation about it. What we know for sure, though, is that the ancient thinker was one of history's weirdest people. Diogenes was born in either 412 or 404 BC in the very remote Greek colony of Sinope. As a young man, he worked with his father, minting currency for the colony. This is until they were both exiled for adulterating the gold and silver content of the coins. Young Diogenes made his way to Corinth in mainland Greece. Almost as soon as he arrived, he seemed to have snapped. With no job, Diogenes adapted to the life of a homeless beggar. He voluntarily threw away all his possessions, except for some rags to hide his nakedness, and a wooden bowl for food and drink. Diogenes often sat in on Plato's classes, eating as loudly as he could the whole time to disrupt the lessons. He argued loudly with Plato about philosophy and would also periodically masturbate in public. He relieved himself whenever and wherever he felt like it, including on Plato's stall in his own academy. It probably didn't help Diogenes' case that he frequently ate whatever he could pick up off the ground. He shared the scraps with the dogs that followed him everywhere, including into Plato's classes. especially Plato, looking foolish. It's said that when Alexander the Great visited him while he was sunning himself naked on top of the barrel in which he lived, and asked if he, the most powerful man in the world, could do anything for the philosopher, Diogenes said, "You could move out of my light." Next we have Terrer, who may have eaten a baby. A French peasant boy, known today as Terrer, was born in Lyon, France in 1772. From an early age, he was insatiably hungry and cried for food even if he just finished a meal. At age 17, the gluttonous yet emaciated Terrer snuck into village barns to eat the livestock's feed. He had an unusually large mouth, was always sweating, and emitted a putrid stench. Terrer's parents kicked him out, and he found himself in Paris right before the French Revolution. He parlayed his uncontrollable hunger into a career, eating strange things for gathering crowds. He ate all types of unpalatable objects, including live animals and even large stones. However, the money dried up when the French Revolution began. Terrer became a soldier, but unsurprisingly, he was chronically ill from compulsively eating stray cats and non-food items. The field hospital reluctantly fed him quadruple rations, until General Alexandre de Beauharnais saw in Terrer a unique opportunity. He approached Terrer about being a spy, delivering military secrets with his stomach as the courier. He agreed and ingested a wooden box containing a note for an imprisoned French colonel. Terrer crossed Prussian lines and within 30 hours was captured, had betrayed France and was savagely beaten. The Prussians dumped Terrer close to French lines and he returned to the military hospital, where he resorted to drinking stored blood and nibbled on the dead residing in the morgue. He was suspected of eating a toddler, and when he never outright denied it, the hospital chased him out. Terrer died horribly around the age of 27. His autopsy revealed festering intestines and an entire body that was putrefied and filled with pus. His digestive system was freakishly mutated, his stomach beginning at the back of his throat and continuing all the way down. Both the lungs and heart were displaced. The sickening smell emanating from Terrer's innards proved too strong for the pathologist, and the autopsy was cut short. We can only speculate what was so wrong with one of the world's weirdest people. Yeah, that's strange. Very strange. Next up we have Lord Byron. Lord Byron was lucky right from his birth in 1788. Besides his deformed right foot, he wasn't supposed to inherit the title Barony of Byron of Rochdale, by which he's remembered. Nevertheless, by age 10, it was his. Along with vast tracts of land and crazy amounts of money, he took an early interest in poetry which he used as a means to say whatever he wanted without being held accountable. Byron's work definitely had arrogance. He often treated poetry as an elaborate revenge mechanism. He used it to publicly insult the likes of his fellow poets Robert Southey and Coleridge and Whitman, whom he relentlessly mocked as humorless trips who only got published because they paid someone off. As wild as Byron's work life was, his private life was even wilder. Authorities at the University of Cambridge told Byron the dogs were not allowed in rooms, so Byron adopted a pet bear. Later, after a few books had made him the toast of sister Augusta, whom he impregnated. Then he married a rich heiress, but couldn't seem to keep his hands off his sister, so the heiress deemed him insane and filed for divorce. In 1816, surrounded by rumours, Byron left England for Percy Bysshe Shelley's home in Switzerland. He was present while Mary Shelley composed Frankenstein, or he may have been sleeping with her sister in the next room. Accounts differ. By the end of that year, Byron moved to Italy, where he taught himself Armenian and rewrote the Bible with what he thought were better stories. While living in Ravenna, Percy Shelley recalled that Byron let 5 peacocks, 2 guinea hens and an Egyptian crane roam freely in his home, insisting that they were reincarnated souls. Byron eventually sold an estate he held in Scotland and gave the money away in Greece, which was fighting for independence, and had invited him to come and help, despite his complete lack of military experience. A sudden illness ended his life at age 36 before he could see a single battle. However, to this day, Byron and his money are remembered as heroes of the Greek Revolution and as one of history's weirdest people. And finally, we have Hetty Green. Hetty Green got rich during America's Gilded Age, which was a fantastic time to be wealthy. During the years after the Civil War, millionaires could get away with almost any eccentric behaviour, but even by the standards of the age, Hetty stood out. Born the daughter of a prosperous whaling family in 1834, her real wealth came when she married millionaire Edward Henry Green in 1867. In an unusual move at the time, Hetty negotiated a prenuptial contract that kept the couple's finances strictly separate. Edward agreed without hesitation, and Hetty divorced him when the bank began to use her money as if it were his. In his later bankruptcy filing, Edward's worldly assets consisted of $40 and a gold watch. Edward would die young. All her life, Hetty had been careful with money, starting with a modest inheritance and a few of the tips her grandfather left her before he died. Hetty amassed a fortune in equity and commodities trading that may have topped $1 billion, equal to $27 billion today. Despite her vast wealth, Hetty was miserly to the point of absurdity. For instance, she never spent money on an office, preferring to conduct business sitting on the floor of her bank, surrounded by paperwork. Given the number of zeros on those papers, the bank probably didn't mind this quirk. Less quirky was her paranoia. Hetty often took hours to walk home from the bank because of the lengthy detour she took to shake imaginary stalkers. Her detractors, many of whom called her the Witch of Wall Street, spread the story that Hetty would only eat oatmeal she'd warmed over her radiator, thinking coal too expensive for running a stove. They may have been right. Hetty's cheapness extended to returning a 10-cent broom she'd bought years before, when its bristles wore out. But it was someone else who paid an excruciating price for her frugality. When her son Ned broke his leg as a child, Hetty tried to set the leg herself. When that didn't work, she disguised herself and her son as paupers and tried to get in at the free clinic. After they kicked her out, Hetty, to boys' screams be damned, set the broken leg at last. Apparently she did finally consent to pay for medical care when Ned's leg became infected and had to be amputated. Indeed, Green's immense frugality at the expense of her own children's health history video. I think I might just do world's weirdest people in history, because I'm sure there are plenty more. But yeah, my friends, that was 1 hour of historical facts. I really hope you did enjoy it. It's been a little while since we've sat down and just whispered straight history facts, so hopefully you found it interesting and relaxing.